People have long had a fascination with hauntings involving various means of transportation. Phantom planes, trains, and ghost ships have long been a source of many a spellbinding tale. But let's not forget our favorite means of transportation, the automobile. Cars without drivers, cars that seemingly appear and disappear into thin air, and cars that carry curses like James Dean's Poor Spider 550. But one vehicle is said to have gone a step further into the realm of murder and mayhem, and that car was not only the basis of a famous horror movie, it still exists today. So buckle your seatbelts, because this is extremely strange. The 1964 Dodge 330 Limited Edition was a full-size automobile that was sold from 1962 to 1964 and available in both 2- and 4-door models. Only around 5,000 of them were made. A few of these vehicles were purchased by the Old Orchard Beach, Maine Police Department as patrol cars. But one in particular was used as a first respondent vehicle, which could transport as many as 8 officers to the scene at high speed. For reasons not known to this day, this particular car is thought to have played a prominent role in a series of deaths that began with all 3 officers who drove it during its service time. Details are sketchy about the first 2 officers to die, but shockingly they were both victims and perpetrators of murder-suicides in the late 1970s and early 1980s. According to the car's current owner, all that is known is that both were French-Canadian, with one going by the nickname of the Babe and the other known only as Adam. They took the lives of their spouses before taking their own. The last officer that was assigned the car also died under the same gruesome circumstances. He was Animal Control Code Enforcement Officer Bruce Savoy, and in 2009, then 55-year-old Savoy shot and killed his wife of 20 years, 50-year-old Stacy, and then turned the gun on himself. Their bodies were found by a neighbor who had come by the house that morning to walk their dog. Apparently, the couple was headed for a breakup. While in police service, the car was known to suddenly change speeds without any prompting from the driver, and its seatbelts were known to release by themselves. Even more alarmingly, the doors would open while the car was in motion. A mechanic who looked over the vehicle claimed he could not find any apparent reason for the malfunctions. Growing concerned about the stigma being attached to the car and its continued mishaps, it was auctioned off a year later to an elderly doctor named La Rochelle, who hand-painted it from its original silver color to a more distinctive gold. He too experienced many of the car's unexplained issues. He might park another car near the Dodge that suddenly failed to start. Bringing it to a mechanic, it was discovered that 2 other cars parked near it at the garage also lost power, and the mechanic suggested there might be an issue underground where it was parked, perhaps a faulty power line. It's also said La Rochelle had named the car Christine. Now think of where Stephen King, the famous horror writer, calls home, and what's been the backdrop of many of his stories, and the name of this car, and I think you might get an idea where all this is going. In 1972, a man named Dave Marcotte painted the car a 1964 Cadillac copper penny color that remains to the current day. It was said, while under La Rochelle's ownership, he accidentally ran over a 2-year-old girl, who thankfully survived, and it was then that rumors fanned more flames of a curse connected to the car. La Rochelle sold the car to a fireman named Kenneth Ricker Allen for $5 in 1975, and the car then had special municipal plates assigned to it, along with red strobe lights and a siren. It was used as a first respondent vehicle by the fire department, who benefited from the high rate of speed it was capable of and often used it in place of an ambulance. Allen felt some adjustments to the circuits and engine would solve any problems that might arise, but he would eventually be proven wrong. But in the meantime, he was deemed a hero when he drove a 10-year-old burn victim from Old Orchard Beach to St. Jude's Hospital non-stop, escorted by state police. And it's been said a number of witnesses saw the car in its mad dash to St. Jude's fly by them with flames coming from its wheels, and when it returned to Old Orchard Beach, its tires were burned down to the metal ply with the tread completely gone. With stories like this one, the local fire department, unlike the police, saw the vehicle as something of a good luck charm and a lifesaver, and held it in high regard, counterclaiming it was actually powered by angels. While under the ownership of Allen and his wife, who his daughter Wendy, more on her in a minute, identified as something of a gypsy clan, the car gained notoriety not only for its historic sprints to hospitals, but for what Wendy said was the Evel Knievel style in which it was driven. She claims at one point she was in the back seat during a 230-mile run from Portland to Biddeford, on train tracks no less, all the while being closely followed by a freight train, eventually crashing through a warning gate on its journey. All the while, the car was full of firemen giving police officers who were driving alongside on the actual roads the finger, while they continued on this insane joyride. Now here we stop to tell you a little bit about Wendy Allen, who is a self-described writer of erotica, horror, and science fiction, and is the current owner of this car. She also identifies as an artist, a voodoo priestess, a gypsy queen, and an art car designer, whatever that is. She claims to be currently working toward bringing those people to justice who attacked her in 2015 and in the process killed her unborn child. She is currently working with both local police and FBI as a means to this end. She also states that these attacks continued on, destroying her home and in the process a bomb being found on her property. Her attackers, in her words, are white supremacists from Maine who don't approve of her choice of lifestyle. And while she indeed has some extraordinary and quite emotional recollections of her past and present, for our purposes, we'll do our best to stick with the facts. Nonetheless, in 1983, Wendy Allen, otherwise known as Eelcat in various social media sites, came into possession of the car, well aware of the whispers and rumors of the alleged curse that surrounded it. But soon she would discover the dead carcasses of various animals in proximity of the car, almost daily. It began with a dead bird on the car's hood one morning, which wasn't all that unusual, but in the weeks to come this disturbing trend continued, with the discovery of a baby rabbit found lying alongside the car with no apparent injuries and appearing otherwise healthy. Soon more animals were found, and a week later, a neighbor informed Wendy that a dead fox was at the top of her driveway. Wendy began to think that somehow she was being targeted and a message was being sent to her by a local church group she had a number of run-ins with, and it was likely to relate back to the car, which had already gained a reputation as a symbol of something representing evil. Trying to determine the potential cause of the animal's deaths, she brought the fox to a local vet, where she was told that the animal had most likely died from, of all things, electrocution. When more animal corpses were found, she again brought them to the vet for examination, and as was the case with the fox, again it was determined electrocution seemed to be the reason for their demise. Looking for any exposed wiring on her property, she found nothing, but nonetheless brought the car to a mechanic to eliminate any possibility the vehicle might somehow be responsible. He found no probable cause for what happened to the animals, but a gnawing suspicion grew that the car itself might be generating some type of lethal energy field that killed them when they ventured too closely. But Wendy continued to drive the car herself without incident, sharing rides with others, until one afternoon while running some errands with others into the town of Scarborough, In the passenger seat was Letta Bryant, the wife of a local clergyman. As the group chatted while driving down the highway, the front passenger door suddenly flew open. Letta screamed out in shock and grabbed onto her seatbelt to stop from being ejected from the vehicle, but then the belt released itself, causing her to fall toward the open door. Alan hit the brakes, but rather than stopping, the vehicle instead sped up. With this, Letta lost her grip and fell out onto the highway. Immediately, Wendy somehow regained control of the car and brought it to a stop. Everyone got out of the car to tend to Letta, who fortunately did not suffer any great injury, but Wendy was told to get away by the now angry and bewildered Mrs. Bryant, who pronounced the car to be possessed and told of feeling a pair of icy cold hands yank her out onto the road. After this latest unsettling incident, the car was brought to Mac's garage in Old Orchard, where the door and seat belts were checked, and it was determined that both were faulty, and that the door lock would disengage at 45 miles per hour. The issues were fixed, but attempts to apologize to both Mrs. Bryant and the Reverend Bryant were met with rejection and disdain. The incident resulted in the local church demanding the car be removed from the town completely, as the rumors of its cursed history began to take on a new life. While Alan steadfastly refused to rid herself of the car, more incidents began to follow. 2 children at separate times were said to be riding their bicycles past Alan's house and were hit by cars. Both were said to have died from their injuries before help could arrive, but no documentation of this could be found. Renewed efforts to get rid of the car were rebuked by Alan, who maintained her right to park the car on the road outside her home. Then one day she was approached outside her house by a congregation member from the local church, who at first pled and then demanded her to at the very least allow the pastor to perform an exorcism on it. This was laughed off by Alan, who steadfastly refused any suggestion the car was somehow possessed or cursed. The debate grew louder and more intense until police were summoned to separate the two. Then a week later, Wendy heard through a local radio broadcast that the woman who had confronted her had been killed in an automobile crash when an 18-wheeler had braked hard to avoid a collision and jackknifed across the road. The woman drove her car into the trailer and was decapitated in the crash. The driver of the truck swore he saw her speed up as she approached. This resulted in the Arundel Christian Tabernacle Church becoming even more displeased with Wendy Allen and her accursed car, and its pastor, Bernard Elliott, began an ever more vigorous campaign to have it banished from town, going so far as to encourage vandalism as a means to an end. Then in 2008, a resident and University of Maine student named Matthew Cushing was convicted of murdering 3 family members. The prevailing story in Old Orchard Beach was, on a dare from friends, he approached and touched the vehicle, then went home and killed his mother, stepfather, and stepbrother with a knife, then set the house afire. Though other motives and a degree of premeditation were uncovered upon investigation, that knowledge did little to persuade residents who decided to take matters into their own hands. In 2010, church members who were now convinced Wendy Allen was a witch and had placed a curse on the car stole the vehicle from outside Allen's home and brought it to a local scrapyard to be destroyed. When the metal crusher began its descent to squash the vehicle, it suddenly lost power and the car escaped annihilation. Not to be denied, church members then disassembled the car into smaller pieces and sold off the parts. When she discovered what had happened, Wendy Allen went on a crusade to recover as many parts as possible and move them to a secure location where the car is rumored to have been reassembled and out of public view. All told, some have claimed as many as 34 suicides, beheadings, and death by lightning strikes have been attributed to the car. And while there are documented cases where the vehicle seems to have played a weird ancillary role in some of these tragedies, no proof is required when your mind is already made up. Nonetheless, the story circulated, reaching the attentive ears and the creative mind of horror writer Stephen King, a resident of Bangor, Maine, who adopted the story into the best-selling novel and subsequently classic murderous car film, Christine. And as a result of its notorious history, Old Orchard Beach has become something of a destination spot for people wanting to catch a glimpse or just touch the car, as some claim it has healing powers. I don't know about that, but even MUFON got into the act, claiming the car gives off high levels of radiation. So what we have is the classic story of weird circumstances surrounding an inanimate object that eventually takes on a life of its own. But is there something about this car that carries a curse? You can judge that for yourself, but you might want to think twice about ever hitching a ride in this automobile.